Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I'm going to start out with a story that's got a little bit of a moral to it, and then we'll talk about some practical uses for this moral to try to get you to be a better chess player. The story is about the beginner who told the grandmaster that the Ruy Lopez was a bad opening because it loses. He loses a piece when he plays the Ruy Lopez. So the story starts out that the grandmaster is giving the beginner a lesson, and the beginner says, "I need to know some openings. Can you show me an opening?" And the grandmaster says, "Sure, I'll show you one of the oldest and most respected openings. I'll show you the Ruy Lopez." So the grandmaster shows e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. He says, these are the moves of the Ruy Lopez. And he says, so when you're white, then you can play this, and it's a good opening. And the grandmaster says, the most common move here is to play a6 for black and hit the bishop. And then you're going to back the bishop up to a4 like that. And the beginner says, okay, I got it. So the beginner goes and he plays in an event, and he comes back at the next lesson and he tells the grandmaster, that Ruy Lopez you taught me is a terrible opening. And the grandmaster says, say what? And the beginner says, I played the Ruy Lopez and I lost my bishop. And the grandmaster says, well, you shouldn't if you play right. Can you show me? And the beginner says, well, I did exactly what you told me to. So the grandmaster says, okay. So they set up the board. And the beginner looks at his score sheet, I guess, and shows him the game. He says, all right, I played e4. And my opponent played c5. And the grandmaster says, wait. He says, this isn't a Ruy Lopez, this is a Sicilian. And the beginner says, well, wait, I haven't shown you everything yet. And the grandmaster says, well, okay. And the beginner says, I did what you showed me, and I played knight f3. And the grandmaster says, well, yeah, that's the move in the Ruy Lopez, but in the Sicilian, you don't necessarily play the same moves. But yes, here knight f3 is the main move, so good. And the beginner says, and my opponent played knight to c6. And the grandmaster says, well, the main move here is d4. And the beginner says, well, you didn't show me that. You showed me bishop to b5. So I played bishop b5. And the grandmaster says, yes, but I didn't show you that in this position. I showed you bishop b5 when black had played e5 and not c5. And here it's the Rossolimo variation, which is perfectly good, but this isn't what I showed you. And the beginner says, well, I thought it was what you showed me. You push the pawn to e4, then you play knight f3, then you play bishop b5. And the grandmaster said, well, yes, but that's only if your opponent plays e5 and then knight c6. He played c5, not e5. And the beginner said, well, you didn't tell me that. So the beginner said, so my opponent did play a6. And the grandmaster says, all right, now you're supposed to take the knight. And the beginner said, well, you told me to play bishop a4. And the grandmaster goes, oh no. And he says, so I played bishop a4 right away. And my opponent played b5 and hit my bishop with a pawn. And I had to bring my bishop back to b3. And now he played c4 and he trapped my bishop. So I lost the bishop doing what you said. And this Ruy Lopez is no good. And the grandmaster said, well, the problem is this is not a Ruy Lopez. This is a Sicilian. And it's similar moves for white, but black's playing a different moves, so you can't play the same moves. And the beginner said, well, you didn't tell me that. I thought this was the Ruy Lopez. Now, this gets into the issue of a system versus an opening. I think I've talked in earlier videos about the fact that if you play a system for white, let's say you play a King's Indian attack, and you play knight f3, d5, g3, e6, I'm just making moves for black, bishop g2, c5, castle, knight f6, d3, to some extent you can kind of ignore what black's playing and play those moves no matter what. But the Ruy Lopez isn't like that. The Ruy Lopez is an opening where your moves only make sense if they're doing the exact same moves. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, it takes two to tango here to make a Ruy Lopez. Both sides have to be playing the Ruy Lopez moves for it to be a Ruy Lopez. It's not like the King's Indian attack. It's not a system. So in the Ruy Lopez, when black plays a6 and you play bishop a4, that's the good move. But if you're playing a Sicilian and you play the same moves for white, this is not a Ruy Lopez. This is a Rossalimo variation of the Sicilian. And when he plays a6, you can't play bishop a4 because he's going to trap your bishop. So what's a good move in the one opening, which is similar, with a pawn on e5 instead of c5, is a really bad move if they have a pawn on c5 instead. So the beginner didn't understand that, and he'd end up losing his bishop. Alright, so the beginner had told the grandmaster that the Ruy Lopez was a bad opening because he thought the Ruy Lopez was playing e4, knight f3, bishop b5, not that both players had to make the same moves. Alright, so I had a student who showed me a game this week where he had a similar problem. He played the Queen's Gambit, d4, d5, c4. Now, as I've mentioned in previous videos, the only three major moves for black here are pawn moves. They are e6 to guard the pawn that way, c6 Slav to guard it that way. The first one was the Queen's Gambit decline. This one's the Slav. And the third one is to play d takes c4, Queen's Gambit accepted. Those are the three major moves. Sure, there's other moves like, I think this is Chigorin, Albin counter Gambit. There's some rarer moves. But the main moves are those three pawn moves. Why does black make those pawn moves? What do they have in common? Well, to some extent, they stop a threat that white has. White has a threat. Let's say black does nothing and plays h6. Then white can take the pawn. And if black takes back with the queen, white can develop the knight, AWL, attack with something worth less, and attack the queen. And now the queen has to move again. And if you develop a piece from a square where it's doing nothing to a square where it's doing something, and you attack something that's worth more that has to just move again and waste the tempo, then they call that winning a tempo, because you get the tempo to develop the knight, and he doesn't get a tempo to bring out another piece. He has to move the queen again. So when white plays the Queen's Gambit after d4, d5, c4, in a sense he's threatening to take the pawn, and the idea of the Queen's Gambit declined is if white takes the pawn, black's going to take back with the pawn, and then you can't AWL the queen. If he plays the Slav, it's the same thing. Then when you take the pawn, he's going to take back with the pawn, and you can't attack the queen. So that's kind of a threat. Well, my student didn't understand that, and he was playing a game at the club last week, and his opponent, who was a very weak opponent, played a6. Well, now white should carry out his threat. He should play pawn takes. In fact, if you look over here on the right, where the engine is analyzing, it says pawn takes pawn gives white an advantage of about 1.2. 1.2 is already past near that level where you're already winning the game. You need about a pawn advantage to be thinking of not just being better, but actually being close to winning. So already black's in big trouble if he takes the pawn, but white didn't understand what he was threatening. He just learned the Queen's Gambit decline. For instance, e6, knight c3, knight f6, bishop to g5. That's what he learned. He just learned those moves, just like the beginner did for the Ruy Lopez. So what happened after black played a6 was, instead of white taking the pawn and punishing black, white played knight to c3, which is the normal move against e6 in the Queen's Gambit decline. The normal move against c6 is knight f3, but knight c3 is certainly playable, and grandmasters do play the knight c3 line a lot as well. Okay, so knight c3. So now black could even start thinking about taking that pawn and then holding on to it with b5, but instead black played knight f6. But again, white could maybe make use of this AWL idea. He could take the pawn, and if black takes with the knight, he could AWL the knight with the pawn, and now the knight would take, and white would take, and white would have a big center. This would be similar to the main line of the Grunfeld, except that instead of playing the helpful g6 to develop the bishop on the fianchetto, black would have played the very unhelpful a6, and white would just have a good center here. The engine says white's advantage in this position is about 0.8. All right, so let's go back to their game. In their game, it was d4, d5, c4, a6, knight c3, knight f6. What do you think white played here? Well, white still thinks he's in a queen's gambit decline, and I looked at white's time stamping. In this game, white was making these moves almost instantly, as if he was in the book, but he wasn't. So white's playing fairly quickly here, thinking he's playing a queen's gambit decline, and he's playing the moves just like the guy did in the Ruy Lopez when he was actually in the Sicilian. And he plays bishop g5. And now black plays d takes c4 finally. Okay, well, if white plays queen to a4 check to try to get the pawn back, and black plays b5, then knight takes b5 no longer works, like it does in some lines. Why does that not work? The pawn on a6 is pinned. It's a sneaky pin. We're taking off the piece that's guarded by a pinned piece. If black plays a takes b5, then white has queen takes a8. Why doesn't that work? Well, black cannot take the knight. Instead, he could just pin it to the queen. And now white's in big trouble. If black had played any other move there, then black's the one in trouble. For instance, if he plays, let's make a silly move like h6 to hit the bishop, then double check is mate. Knight to d6 or knight to c7 is double check, checkmate. Because on a double check, only the king can move to get out of the double check, and here he can't. So it would be mate. But anyway, so back to the game. Black played d takes c4, and we just saw the queen a4 check, b5 doesn't work. Black would hold on to the pawn. So in the game, I think white could have played something like a4 to try to stop b5 here. That would have given him a fighting chance. I think he played knight f3 or maybe e3, but in any case, black got to play b5, and when white played e3, black played c6, and black was holding on to his pawn, and black has a good position here. Engine says minus 0.7. Okay, so my student didn't know what he did wrong, but in a sense, you could see it was very similar to what the beginner did in the Ruy Lopez. He thought he was playing a queen's gambit decline. He was playing queen's gambit decline moves for white fairly quickly, but black wasn't playing a queen's gambit decline for black. And white had no idea when this was going on or after the game what had happened. As far as he was concerned, all those quick moves he played in the opening were very normal quick moves. And I told him at the lesson, I said, when your opponent plays a move that's not a very normal move, like what would happen here with a6, when black plays that move a6, you should stop and say, wait a second, that's not the queen's gambit decline. That's a pretty rare move. Why don't people play that move? What can I do about it? Maybe you wouldn't figure it out right, but you shouldn't play this move fast. You should take at least a little bit of time to try to figure out what in the heck's going on here. All right, let's try a different opening now. I was talking to another student about playing c5 in the French. And let's look at the advanced French. e4, e6, d4, d5. And now a lot of beginners love to play the advanced variation. They think that's the way to refute the French, is to get the space. And they play e5, which is not a bad move, but it is hard to play for white if you don't know what you're doing. And now we have the pointing rule, which you could watch my other video on the pointing rule, where all four center pawns are locked together and which way they're pointing tells you which way you should attack and which way you should break. And here black needs some space. He needs to attack the white pawn chain. If he would make a move like knight c6, then once white guards the pawn chain with c3, not necessary yet because the queen was guarding the pawn, black's going to be very, very cramped here, and it's going to be tough to get his pieces out. So that's why in the French, after e4, let's go back to that line, e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, the only move that's really played frequently here is c5. Occasionally you see b6 or maybe a knight e7 or a bishop e7. But 90% of the time people play c5 here to hit the pawn chain at its base, and then white breaks back. So we could kind of think of c5 as being almost de rigueur, in other words, required in this kind of position. For instance, if you play b6 first, okay, you could do that, but eventually the idea is to get that pawn up to c5 anyway. So black's got to play this move here. Now, suppose you generalize that erroneously and say, well, therefore in the French you should always play c5. All right, that would not be true because Frenches could be lots of different positions. For instance, suppose white plays the exchange variation. E takes D, and then plays knight f3. Okay, so here, again, you could say, well, in Frenches, you play c5, so I should play c5 here. And you would say, that's a little bit like a queen's gambit upside down. That looks like a good move. All right, but if you look over here on the right where the engine is analyzing, c5 is not one of the top 3 moves. Knight f6 is number 1, c6 is number 2, not c5, and bishop d6. So if you generalized and said whenever someone plays the French, you should play c5 for black, that's not true, because why is c5 so much weaker here? Well, first of all, in the other position, let's go back to the other position for a second. In the other position, black is in danger of being cramped with the e5 pawn, so he needs to break open lines and get some space. But in the exchange variation, black is not cramped at all. In fact, black's pawn structure is symmetric with white's. Look at his bishops. They're both really good. So he doesn't need to break open any lines. He's got an E file for his rooks, an open file. He's got open lines for all his pieces. He doesn't have to break up white's pawn chain right now. He's not really trying to attack this d4 pawn. So if black plays c5 here, let's say white plays knight f3, and black plays c5, white at some point can trade these two pawns. Doesn't have to take it right away and help the bishop develop. The engine says the best move is to first check so you can castle. Check, it gives knight c6, and then something like castles or knight c3. But let's say these pawns get traded. What happens? Well, it's true, you open up this line now for the bishop, but it was already open. You blocked it yourself with the pawn. And now white has this target of this isolated d pawn on d5 because black traded off the side pawn for the center pawn, which is usually good, but here it isolates the pawn on d5, and that's not so good. So here, black playing c5 and c takes d4 here is not nearly as good. In fact, it's actually kind of weak compared to doing it in the advanced variation. Now, suppose, on the other hand, we have a Cole system. d4, d5, e3, e6. Well, here you cannot use the pointing rule because the center pawns are not all locked together. The e-pawns are not up against each other. If you use the pointing rule, it would give you nonsense like black is better on the queen side and should attack on the queen side, and white is better on the queen side and should attack on the queen side. That's sort of like saying that your brother is taller than you, but you're taller than your brother. Well, if the pointing rule should always point to opposite sides of the board. If it both point to the same side of the board, then you must be misapplying the pointing rule because it could never do that when you're using the pointing rule correctly. So here, could both sides still break with c5 and c4? And the answer is sure. We've got these pawns up against each other. There's no open file anywhere. So playing c4 here for white is a really good move. And if white doesn't play that, let's say he plays knight f3 instead, which is also a reasonable move, then it's very reasonable for black to play c5. In fact, that's one of the main lines here in the Cole system. White could play c3, knight c6, putting the knight behind the c-pawn, bishop d3, and we're in one of the main lines of the Cole system. So c5 here is a really good move. Notice if white ever takes it and black takes back, this pawn is not isolated. He's guarded by an e-pawn. So again, this is back to a position where c5 is very good for black. Not quite the same as it was when the white pawn was on e5, where it's absolutely required, but it's still the right kind of idea, which is not the right idea that it is in the exchange variation. In the exchange variation, whoops, let's go back to exchange French. As we said in the exchange variation, now black playing c5 is not necessary at all. In fact, we saw that the computer prefers, after a move like knight f3, if you're going to move the c-pawn at all, it likes to play the pawn to c6 to guard the d-pawn so the queen doesn't have to do it during the rest of the opening. So c6 is actually a preferred move. The engine says the other best moves are to get your pieces out so you can castle. Play knight f6, play bishop d6. John Watson recommends black try to castle queenside here to create some fun in his book, Play the French, 3rd, 4th edition. All right, so let's try a different variation of the French. Let's try the Rubinstein variation. e4, e6, d4, d5, and now it doesn't matter whether white plays knight c3 classical or knight d2 Tarrasch. We'll just play Tarrasch. And now white takes, and knight takes, and now let's say black plays, well, let's just ask c5 already. c5, the engine says maybe black should wait a move, so we could wait a move. We could play knight f6 here. We could play knight d7, knight f3. Engine is still waiting here. Let's play a6, bishop d3. All right, so let's turn off the engine for a second. All right, so let's say you get to this position. This is not one of the main lines, but I just did it because the engine mentioned I could play these moves. Is it a good idea now for black to play c5, or is it a bad idea? Is this more like the lines we looked at where c5 is a good idea, or is it more like the ones where it's a bad idea? Clearly it falls a little bit in between, but it's going to be more toward the good side or more toward the bad side. Well, if we look at the one where it was toward the bad side, when it was toward the bad side, there was already an open file on the board. Completely open, not semi-open, completely open. Both bishops had very good strength. And if you play c5 here for black, at some point you could easily end up with an isolated pawn on d5. Probably white wouldn't take right away, but that tension would be resolved in black getting an isolated d-pawn. In the line we just looked at, if I can remember that move order, computer suggested a little bit of a strange move order. Pawn takes, knight takes. I think we had played knight d7, knight f3, and now he played a strange move like a6. Usually you play knight f6 here, but just for the fun of it, a6, bishop d3, c5, what do you think? Bad or good? Well, first of all, we have to see if it's safe. White's attacking it twice. Black's guarding it twice. Safe. Okay. It's safe, but is it positionally good? Well, right now, does black have lines for both of his bishops? No. Who has more space in the center here? White has a pawn on the D file on the 4th rank, but black's pawn in the center is on the 6th rank, meaning white has a lot more space for his pieces right here. Notice both his bishops are pretty good, while black's queen bishop is still suffers from that French block with e6 problem. So here, c5 is a very good move. And if we turn on the engine, Mr. Engine, what do you say? Engine says the two best moves are knight gf6 and c5. So c5 is a good idea here. It's not such a good idea in some. So again, you have to be careful. What's good in some positions, in similar positions is not. Now I have another video called Similar Positions is Not the Same, and I guess you could consider that a cousin video to this video. Similar positions is not the same. But today's video we wanted to talk about, be careful when you learn opening lines. Try to figure out if it's a system where you could just play those moves for white, let's say, or just for black and kind of ignore what your opponent's doing. Or much more commonly, it's an opening like the Ruy Lopez or the Sicilian or the Grunfeld or the Queen's Gambit declined, where both players have to be doing exactly what you studied. Otherwise, your moves may or may not make sense, but you just can't play them fast. You don't want to do what happened to my student in that game, where he quickly was throwing in all those Queen's Gambit decline moves, but black wasn't playing Queen's Gambit declined, and black was actually playing a very poor line where white could have punished him. Let's go back to that again to show what I'm talking about. d4, d5, c4, Queen's Gambit. Black played a6. a6, not a good move. Why? It doesn't meet the threat of pawn takes pawn, and you have potential for possibly winning a tempo here. Instead, white did exactly the opposite of what he should have, as we said earlier, after by playing all these queen's gambit kind of moves, eventually black got the idea, why don't I just take that pawn and then guard it? And black ended up just up a pawn with a good game here. And that was because white was doing what the player did with the grandmaster, where he was playing the moves for the queen's gambit declined, but black wasn't playing those moves, just like the beginner played the moves for the Ruy Lopez, but his opponent was playing a Sicilian, and he ended up getting his bishop trapped. So that's the moral of today's video. We looked at, don't play the moves just because they're the moves you're supposed to play in the opening. We looked at something more sophisticated in the French where, should you play c5 or not? Well, in some positions you absolutely should. In other positions it's not very good. In other positions it's good but not absolutely required. It runs the gamut between you absolutely would have to play it to where it's not very good at all. And you have to look at each position and decide that for yourself. Is it normally a good idea to play c5s in Frenches? Well, yes, but not in every line of the French. It would just be true in most lines of the French, but you have to know when it is. It's much better to understand you don't understand the opening by saying you should play c5s in Frenches. Well, you understand the opening when you look at the position on the board and you say, I understand this position, and this position c5 makes sense, and in the other position c5 doesn't make as much sense. Then you're really understanding what's going on. It's not understanding to just say c5 is usually a good move in the French. That's a little bit of knowledge, but sometimes a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. All right, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. For my YouTube channel, please tell your friends about it. I thank everybody who helped me get to 5,000 subscribers. If you like the video, you can like it. If you haven't subscribed, you can. Most important thing I always tell people is please tell your friends about the channel Dan Heisman Chess, or my chess tip of the day on Twitter at Dan Heisman. See you next time. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.